Hello everybody! Today I want to talk about the Library of Alexandria and how it was destroyed. Well, the first thing is to talk about who didn't destroy the Library of Alexandria, because it wasn't destroyed by Julius Caesar. That's a really popular one. People like to say that Julius Caesar destroyed the Library of Alexandria when he marched into Alexandria chasing after Pompey. And specifically, the story usually goes that when he was presented with Pompey's head, he was so horrified and revolted that he burned part of Alexandria and the Library of Alexandria. And he may or may not have burned parts of Alexandria, but he definitely didn't burn the Library of Alexandria because the Library of Alexandria was still there after him. In fact, one of the most prominent students of the Library of Alexandria, the physician Galen, who was a Greek from Pergamon in modern-day Syria, studied there after Caesar supposedly burned it. So we know that Caesar didn't burn the Library of Alexandria. Well, the next common option is the Christians. And they didn't burn the Library of Alexandria either. The story here is that they were intolerant of the pagan learning in the library and that they burned it because it wasn't Christian, it wasn't pure, it wasn't good and godly and moral. And indeed, there were Christian riots in Alexandria. In fact, the monks of Alexandria were known to be particularly anti-intellectual and particularly violent. There was a lot of Christian street violence at the time that the Library of Alexandria would have been burned by the Christians. Indeed, a very, very famous pagan woman philosopher, a great scholar, was killed by a Christian mob in a really horrific way. And this is something that was decried across the remnants of the pagan world. But nobody mentions the Library of Alexandria being burned by this, and that is absolutely something they would have mentioned. That is definitely something that if the surviving pagans could lay that at the Christians' door, they most certainly would have. And could you blame them? So the Christians did not burn the Library of Alexandria. Well, who did? The next option is the Muslims. And we actually do have an account of the leader of the Arab forces in marching into Egypt, burning the Library of Alexandria, because either the books in there either were the Quran, in which case they already had it, or they were not the Quran and therefore were worthless. The problem is that this account, of course, was written down several hundred years later by people who really didn't have a good reason to, say anything nice about him. So, no good evidence there either. And also claiming that the Muslims burned the Library of Alexandria is deeply and bitterly and cruelly ironic, given how much the Muslims did to not only preserve the intellectual heritage of ancient Greece, of the classical and Hellenistic periods, but to commentate on it and expand it. And later when this came to trickle into the West, it was a great boon for Western culture that the Arabs had created this great storehouse of not only ancient Greek learning, but also new learning. So this is, this one is not only bunk, it's also really deeply, horribly ironic. So who did destroy the Library of Alexandria? We've gone through who didn't. Well, let's talk about who did. Well, to understand who did destroy the Library of Alexandria, you have to understand how the Library of Alexandria came about, how it was built, how it was conceived, and how it was founded. And the story begins with Alexander the Great, which, of course it does. This is Alexandria. When Alexander the Great erupted out of Greece and Macedon and conquered huge swathes of the known world, mostly things that were east of Greece, south and east of Greece, he and founded a bunch of cities named Alexandria. Alexandria in Egypt was not the only one. It was his favorite, but it was not the only one. There's actually one in Afghanistan, for example, which is really cool. The Bactrians were kind of awesome. But anyway, he founded, Alexandria, and he spread Greek culture throughout the Eastern world. And the thing about the Eastern world was it was already extremely civilized. Cities had been there for a very long time. The great bearers of civilization were, the Persians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians. And Greece was kind of tangential to this. It was very marginal. The Greeks liked to call everybody who wasn't Greek a barbarian. But actually, the rest of the world kind of saw Greece as a total backwater. And I mean, it wasn't quite as much of a backwater as, say, Italy or France or Spain, but it was a backwater. It was absolutely a backwater. And Greece had colonies in Asia Minor and in Italy. Actually, at the time, Italy was known as Magna Graecia, and in Mediterranean islands, and all the way out to into Marseille. Marseille was a Greek colony. But it was still pretty culturally tangential to the rest of the so-called civilized world, and these great ancient civilizations. Alexander's conquests changed that. These countries were now conquered by a Greek people. The Macedonians were, maybe considered out there by the Greeks, but they were definitely Greek themselves as far as they were concerned. They were Greek. And they spread this Greek culture with them wherever they went. And when Alexander died, young and either of poisoning or infection or possibly alcohol poisoning, because the man drank like a fish, his generals broke apart his short-lived empire into various successor states. And these successor states were all culturally very Greek. And so you had these Greek and Greek syncretic states that sprang up in Alexander's wake. Seriously, guys, look up Bactria. Look up the Greek syncretic Zoroastrian Buddhist country in Afghanistan. It is the best. That is one of those successor states. But anyway, Alexandria. Alexandria and Egypt fell under the control of the Ptolemies. And they were just, one of these various regimes that sprang up in Alexander's wake, and they were in competition with the other regimes. And this competition was military, it was economic, but it was also cultural. And the Ptolemies decided that they wanted to be the most learned and have the biggest cultural impact and have all of this, Greek culture and be the center of learning. And it was a very syncretic country. It was actually, there were a lot of Egyptian culture, customs and culture that found their way into the royal family. This is, for example, why they started marrying extremely close family members, siblings, parents, that sort of thing. And the Ptolemy family tree is horrifying and extremely confusing. Because not only were they marrying very close family members, they all used the same names. It's a mess. So they founded the Library of Alexandria, and it was part of the palace complex, and they had to fill it. So they started, anyone who came to trade in this great breadbasket of the Mediterranean, because Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. It was that during the Ptolemaic times. It was that under Rome. It was extremely fertile and extremely good at producing grain. So it fed huge numbers of people. It fed huge parts of the Mediterranean. People would trade for food, and they would trade for gold. And it was basically an extremely wealthy region. And whoever controlled it made bank. So if you were going to trade with Alexandria and you had any texts on board your ship, they were going to confiscate them. They were going to copy them. You might get a copy back. You might not. And the thing is that people who were, trading with them didn't necessarily like this. This had to be done by force. This was not an option. And if you're going to be doing that kind of thing by force, you have to have a military behind you. And the Library of Alexandria was both extremely expensive and also, required this coercive power. That means that you needed a strong central government that was willing to expend its resources in this manner. So the Library of Alexandria grew and became larger. And there's actually a wonderful story that may not be true, that when Pergamum started founding its own really awesome library, you might remember Pergamum as where Galen was from, but they had their own awesome library, and he still went to Alexandria. So that tells you a lot about the Library of Alexandria. When they started building their library about 100 years later, the Ptolemies supposedly put an embargo on the export of papyrus. Now, at the time, papyrus was the primary writing material throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and in fact, it was another thing that was sourced from Egypt. It's native to Egypt. This is actually where we get the word paper from, papyrus. It was native to Egypt, and it has been used as a writing material in Egypt since time immemorial. Papyrus scrolls are where we get a lot of our hieroglyphic texts. Sorry, everybody, I had a camera hiccup. So papyrus does not, last forever. It degrades, it breaks down, and a lot of the texts that we have from ancient Egypt are fragmented and partial texts. And because of this, those texts have to be renewed and recopied if you want to keep them. But anyway, this embargo of papyrus, supposedly the people at Pergamum invented vellum, so they would have something to write on. And this is a great story because it shows that this was an extremely important part of the sort of jockeying for position and power within the Hellenized world. And it's a lot of fun. But anyway, these texts had to be recopied, renewed. This was itself expensive, and this was an ongoing effort. You couldn't just take the texts once and then be done with them. You had to keep maintaining this, and you had to maintain the scholars. This took a lot of money. This took a lot of resources. This took a lot of centralized control. So the thing is that when you have something that has that level of centralized control, it's vulnerable to shocks to the system. So the Library of Alexandria didn't actually burn. That's the ultimate story here. The Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed. Rome fell. Central authority fell away. It crumbled. As the Roman Empire began to fall, well, what happened first was there were plagues, there were governmental crises, there was food shortages, there was a crisis of economics, of coinage, and there were the so-called barbarians, the various nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes that came down to raid and pillage and invade. And the thing about the tribes is that there were actually always non-Roman peoples attacking the borders of Rome. But when Rome was strong, this didn't matter. Very, very large invasions could be rebuffed fairly easily by a strong Roman Empire. But after a series of plagues and economic collapse and internecine wars and just total breakdown of society, that suddenly those invasions couldn't be rebuffed. And Rome started to crumble from within and from without. And yes, the Eastern Roman Empire did much better than the West. The West, fell and eventually became, Western Europe. It completely disintegrated. Whereas in the East, it kicked around for a while as the Byzantine Empire. But even under the Byzantine Empire, well, the problem was there was a reason that the Muslims, the Arab Muslims, were able to invade and conquer it so easily. there wasn't a lot of really good military and financial support coming from Byzantium to Alexandria. And when you have social and political instability, when you have enemies at the gate, when you have difficulties just maintaining your ability to survive, to get food every day, when there is rioting in the street, maintaining an extremely expensive library is suddenly not your highest priority. In fact, it's not even necessarily something that you even can do, much less want to do. So the Library of Alexandria just stopped being maintained. They didn't have the money to maintain it. They didn't have the will or the energy. People were just trying to survive, and the library was not their first priority. Or even their 10th priority or their 100th. It was not on the list. And those papyrus scrolls just crumbled away. And the library was part of the palace complex, and the palace complex subsided into the harbor. You know, this is a very geographically active area. The Nile Delta and its waterways are shifting all the time, and the Mediterranean coast is shifting all the time, and has subsided into the harbor. We've actually started excavating some of the palace complex now. Yeah, the Library of Alexandria actually might be there underwater. It wasn't burned. It wasn't destroyed. It just faded away and died a very quiet death. And that's a whole lot less romantic. So why do we tell ourselves the story of the burning of the Library of Alexandria? Why is this great story that we tell ourselves about history? Well, remember how I said that the Library of Alexandria was a creature of the Hellenistic world, and that it was, really only possible because of these centralized Hellenistic states that arose after Alexander the Great. So it was absolutely this creation and creature of the Hellenized world, and of the Hellenistic age. And not only was it impossible without it, but it was almost a culmination of it. So it's a great symbol of the Hellenized world, of the Hellenistic world. So who you think brought an end to the Hellenistic world is who you are going to think burned the Library of Alexandria. If you want a baddie to end the Library of Alexandria, to end the Hellenistic age, you're going to have them destroy this great symbol of the Hellenistic age. And if you think Rome did it, you're probably going to think it was Caesar who destroyed the Library of Alexandria. If you think instead that Rome was a torchbearer that carried on Greek civilization, and it was, Rome crumbled because of the Christians, Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire style, you're probably going to think it was the Christians who destroyed the library. If, on the other hand, you think that we are in a great clash of civilizations between the Muslims and the Western civilization, Christendom, Western civilization, depending on which word you want to use, you are racist and have no sense of irony, but also you're probably going to think it was the Muslims who burned the Library of Alexandria. Ultimately, the Library of Alexandria, it was just a library. It didn't actually have the kind of enormous store of knowledge that would have gotten us to the moon, early, the way a lot of people say. In fact, we got most of that knowledge back, between the sort of late Middle Ages through to the Renaissance. We got a huge amount of that information back. The Byzantine Empire preserved a huge amount of Greek culture. The Arabs preserved a huge amount of Greek culture. It didn't disappear. It wasn't necessarily accessible to Europeans for a while, but it didn't really disappear. Most of what was in the Library of Alexandria, we had from other sources. And a lot of what we actually lost was things like plays, not anything that was going to get us to the moon. I would love to have more plays by Sophocles, but ultimately it's not going to change anybody's life a whole lot that we don't have these Greek tragedies. So why do we tell ourselves about this? Well, it's a lot more fun to think that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed by some baddie than it is to accept that it died a quiet death. So, for writers, what does this mean? Well, it means a couple of things. It means that if you have, great events that happened a couple thousand years ago, the way people look at them and the stories they tell about them are probably not going to be particularly accurate. And it means that those stories might tell you a lot about the culture they're in. It means that the stories that they tell themselves might be a pretty good reflection about their own fears and their own biases and their own particular ways of looking at the world. And it means that different people are going to have different stories, and they're going to look at the past and see different things in it. And ultimately, if you want a world that feels very real, you're going to have to take into account not only that people see things very differently because of their own personal histories and personal biases, but that the past is a mirror that people use to reflect themselves. And the stories that people are seeing in the past might bear very, very little resemblance to what actually happened. And many of the stories that we hold as deeply important and reflective of how the world works might be based in a romanticization and wishful thinking. And ultimately, you have to ask yourself, if that's the case, if nobody has a view of the past that is particularly accurate, does what actually happened matter? The answer might be no, but the answer might also be yes. And it is something to think about. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel and possibly leaving a comment. Social media links are in the description below. And I hope you had a lovely day, and if it hasn't been lovely so far, I hope it gets better soon. Bye-bye for now. I hope to see you again.